So let's look at some examples of the type of HABs and their impacts. There are dinoflagellates which are harmful algal blooms, and there are there is a diatom called Pseudonychia which produces domoic acid, which is also a harmful algal bloom, but most of them tend to be dinoflagellates. So they can cause amnesic poisoning, so shellfish which are filter feeders, so they bio-amplify the toxins, so they consume these toxins in the water from the phytoplankton, and they concentrate them because they keep filtering the water, and when human beings consume them, amnesic shellfish poisoning is something that causes temporary amnesia, and you can see the range of locations where amnesic shellfish poisoning happens. Paralytic shellfish poisoning, again temporary paralysis caused by the shellfish poisoning, and much more extensive all the way from the deep tropics to the polar latitudes, unlike the amnesic shellfish poisoning, which is much more restricted, as at least as a baseline, to higher latitudes. And there is diuretic shellfish poisoning, again much more widespread. In each case, the question is, how are the coastal warmings, nutrient runoffs, anoxia, hypoxia, eutrophication, urbanization, and acidification are impacting the frequency of these diuretic shellfish poisoning and their seasonality. For example, up here in the northwest, razor clams, which are recreational activities for people to go and catch and eat them, they tend to be infected with Alexandrium, a harmful algal bloom, during the months where the temperature is warmer than 13 degrees centigrade. With global warming, the number of months with this threshold is increasing, so people are likely to get sick with this toxin released by the harmful algal bloom Alexandrium that's going to infect them. So diuretic shellfish poisoning are quite common. There is generally some allergies. Some people are just allergic to shellfish, but these are people who are not allergic but can get poisoned by the toxins that are in the shellfish. There are also neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. There are many harmful algal blooms like Carenia brevis, which produces a hepatotoxin called brevitoxin, which is able to get aerosolized, so that even if you don't get into the water, you may get sick by just walking on the beach, especially pregnant women and so on. Okay, so there are neurotoxins here as well, and this is the change as an example of paralytic shellfish poisoning from the 1970s to 2017. So it's possible that people are just getting more exposure to waters because people are, let's say, richer and going out into the waters more often for recreations, or they are getting richer and consuming more seafood than before in countries like China and India and so on. So the idea of health outcomes has to be separated into warming effects on the intensity of the blooms and frequency of the blooms and the seasonality of the blooms, and maybe there is also changes in the physiology of the fish, that maybe they are producing more toxins. All these kinds of details have to be separated, of course, but even with all those limitations of data, Ciguatera is another poison that's produced, a toxin that's produced by fish. So Ciguatera fish poisoning frequency by year in Florida from 2003 to 2012 here, and you can see that there are some ups and downs, but you can see generally maybe there is a trend of increasing number of cases over time. But the note here is that Florida's public health surveillance case definition of CFP, Ciguatera fish poisoning, includes clinically compatible illnesses, so not necessarily diagnosed in terms of blood evidence or something, but just by symptoms, and a history of fish consumption within 24 hours before the onset of symptoms. Symptoms associated with CFT include abdominal cramps, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, numbness, and prickling sensation on lips and tongue, fingers and toes, metallic taste, muscle aches, rash, blurred vision, and sensitivity to hot and cold temperatures. To be considered a case of CFP, the victim must have eaten a species of fish that could be contaminated with ciguatoxins. CFP is not nationally notifiable, but many states choose to report cases. So not all states even report CFPs. Okay. Characteristic of human diseases and conditions caused by eating seafood contaminated by phycotoxins, another kind of toxin produced by fish. So paralytic shellfish poisoning, neurotoxic, diuretic, amnesic, azaspiracid shellfish poisoning, and Ciguatera shellfish poisoning. So these are the main areas with endemic diseases. Temperate, Gulf of Mexico, southern US, New Zealand, Europe, Japan. For different types of poisoning, there are different regions, as we already saw in the maps. Associated fish include bivalves, herbivorous fish and crabs, some fin fishes and large reef fishes. Reefs are also getting affected by warming and acidification, which has to be seen whether that's related to toxin production. Acute symptoms include a range of things we already talked about in terms of CFP, but there are others as well. So respiratory, cardiovascular, neurological, progressing to paralysis, muscular aches, chills, headache, fever, and so on. Chronic symptoms, not always known, but the diuretic shellfish poisoning is possibly a carcinogen. You could have amnesia from amnesic shellfish poisoning, and azaspiracid shellfish poisoning is not known to have any chronic symptoms, whereas CFP can produce paresthesiasis. Okay, we'll come back to that. Sorry about that. Treatments include various options like supportive care, possibly respiratory support, intravenous mannitol, and tricyclic antidepressants, and so on. So one of the and there are other details here in terms of incubation times, ranging from few minutes to less than a day. Duration of the symptoms can be days, sometimes years, so chronic, or even months. Death rate 1 to 14% for the paralytic shellfish poisoning, and up to 12% for the CFP. Okay. Toxins range from saxitoxin, brevitoxin, oxalic acid, domoic acid that I mentioned in terms of in the Pseudonychia. There is a nice interesting story about domoic acid. It's a diatom. It produces in the west coast. They are concentrated in shellfish, which are eaten by seabirds, and the seabirds went crazy and attacked people in the 1960s in Santa Barbara, and Hitchcock noticed that and made a scary picture called The Birds out of that. So there you go. Marine toxic, harmful algal bloom related to a nice movie, a scary movie made by none other than Hitchcock. Okay, ciguatoxins, mycotoxin, and sacritoxins. Toxin producing organisms range from dinoflagellates like Gymnodinium catenatum, dinoflagellates like Carenia brevis, Dinophysis, Pseudonychia that I mentioned, Protoperidium, and also Gambierdiscus toxicus, and so on and so forth. Just to conclude, these are the coastal hypoxia and eutrophication regions, areas of anthropogenically influenced estuarine and coastal hypoxia. The chapter only focuses on warming impacts, but I'm going to include this because warming also affects deoxygenation in the water column. So you can see that pretty much all of the world is affected by human activities in terms of coastal hypoxia and anoxia. There are more than 150 sites here. In the past century, hypoxia has been a global concern, with over 550 coastal areas identified as experiencing this problem. Only a small fraction of the 550 plus hypoxic zones exhibited any signs of improvement. So you can see here number of dead zones has approximately doubled each decade since the 1960s. And combined dead zones now cover 4 times the area of the Great Lakes. Today there is currently about 1,148,000 square kilometers of seabed covered by oxygen minimum zones, which is less than 0.5 milliliters of oxygen per liter. Obviously that leads to large fish kill and so on as well, but here we are mostly focusing on potential influences of harmful algal blooms as non-infectious health outcomes among human beings. Okay, so that's a short chapter. We'll now move on to the next chapter in the next podcast, which focuses on impact of CO2 on plants and how that affects pathogens and viruses, bacteria that affect human health. Okay.